People tend to make one of two mistakes with debt. They either shun it entirely and say, "No, I'm not touching debt with a 10-foot pole," or they're too cavalier about it. And let's be honest, most people fall into that latter camp where they're a little too cavalier about it. They rack up the credit card debt, and then they find themselves in a hole, in a deep hole of debt. So today we're going to break down exactly how to approach debt like the wealthy do, as a tool, as a form of leverage, without getting too cavalier about it. So welcome to the Bucks Outside the Box show, where we challenge conventional money advice and we get a little contrarian and think outside the box, right? So,
well, this is really outside the box for me because I grew up thinking all debt was bad. And then I married my husband who thinks all debt is bad. But I'm learning, and it's just very interesting.
Yeah, well, exactly. So debt is a tool like any other tool. And, imagine a knife. A knife can cut you or it can chop the vegetables, right? So you have to learn how to use it skillfully and carefully and conservatively. So Robert Kiyosaki, I want to start with this quote from him because he put this really well. And I'm actually paraphrasing. This is not an exact quote, but it's something along the lines of, good debt makes you richer each month. Bad debt makes you poorer each month. So let's dig into that a little bit, and let's dig into bad debt, because there is some nuance here, especially when we start talking about things like home mortgages. So yeah, it's not black and white. Some bad debt is black and white. So consumer debt is bad debt, right? Credit card balances that you don't pay off in full every month, because again, you only pay interest on credit card balances if you don't pay them off in full. If you pay them off in full,
Right.
there's no interest that you pay. It's all just upside with the points and rewards and whatnot. So credit card balances that you don't pay off in full, bad debt. Do not do it. Personal loans, bad debt. Any kind of consumer debt like that is bad debt. Auto loans, look, transportation is a living expense. The less that you spend on all of your living expenses, the better from a financial standpoint, right?
Right.
So, I was just writing an article for Bigger Pockets about, how people, and myself included, can live on 50% of their income. And one of the points there is that, if you can live without a car, then great. And for 6 years, my wife and I did live without a car. We currently share one car. It's a used Hyundai. It's not a sexy car. Cars should be boring. It's transportation, right? It's a living expense. And often having transportation, having a car is for many people a necessary living expense. That doesn't mean you need to drive a Porsche, right? Or a BMW or a luxury car. So the cheaper, the more boring, the more reliable your car is, the better. If you can live without a car loan, great. Some people have to borrow money to buy a car. The less you borrow, the better, right? Auto loans are bad debt.
Now, is there any time a fancy car is warranted, or if it's desired, it's ever workable? Or
Sure, if you're Elon Musk. If A, you're the richest man in the world, and B, you sell cars, then yeah. But for the average person, there was a book, a couple of decades ago that was quite popular at the time called The Millionaire Next Door, and the idea just being stealth wealth, right? And that you build wealth by saving and investing as much money as possible, and not by showing off your wealth. And in fact, Deni, this is something that you and I talk about all the time on the show, is the paradox of wealth. That the more wealth that you show off, like the more wealth that you flash in your life, the fancy house, the flashy car, the latest like stylish clothes, that makes you look rich and it makes you feel rich. It makes you poorer, right?
right.
So, real wealth.
Even if you're like my father loved Mercedes, but I remember when he had to get it repaired, it was like ridiculous. So even that you have to keep in mind.
Oh yeah, and that's yeah. So European cars do cost more to maintain and repair than American and Asian cars. Just as an aside. But yeah, look, at a certain level of wealth, you can afford to pamper yourself a little bit. But that's still, auto loans are still bad debt, is the bottom line, right? They are basically a form of consumer debt. Sometimes you may need a car and you may need an auto loan to afford a car. But the less of it you have, the less auto loan you have, the better. The less car debt you have, the better, right? is the bottom line here. All right, home mortgage. And this one has some nuance, but ultimately the same principle applies in most cases, that it's a living expense, right? Housing is a living expense. The less you spend on it, the better, as far as your savings rate, being able to save money, invest, and build wealth. So the less of a home mortgage loan that you have, the better. It is bad debt for most intents and purposes. That being said, we're going to come back to this in a second because there is some nuance here, and we have to, and it bears a little bit more conversation. Let's switch gears and talk about good debt. So the classic example of good debt, the best example, is a mortgage loan on a rental property, a straight rental property, not a second home that you go and somewhere in the Hamptons, but an actual pure investment property that is making you money every month despite the debt. And in fact, the debt is what enabled you to acquire that investment, right? So, you go out, you buy a rental property, you take out a mortgage on it, but you're still cash flowing an extra $500 a month or an extra $1,000 a month. Now that's, and just one quick aside here, because this is something that, has been a pet peeve of mine for decades. The cash flow is not the rent minus the mortgage. Rental properties come with other expenses, irregular expenses beyond the mortgage payment. So repairs and maintenance, vacancy rate. Obviously you have to pay for property taxes and insurance, property management costs. Even if you plan to manage the property yourself, it is still a labor expense. It's your hours, because you're comparing that against a purely passive investment, like what we do in the co-investing club, private notes and syndications and private partnerships, or like, index funds, right? Going out and just buying shares in index funds through your brokerage account. Those are purely passive investments. Rental properties are not purely passive, especially if you're trying to manage it yourself. So
No,
so the
you
point being,
have tenants and toilets.
yeah, absolutely. So we actually, on sparkrental.com, we have a free rental property cash flow calculator, which you can run the numbers, to, take those average costs of repairs and maintenance and vacancy rate and so forth. But, so
Quick question though.
yeah,
There is tax benefits to all this that reduces the debt.
you're talking about rental property mortgages?
Mhm.
Rental properties? Yeah, so you can deduct the interest that you pay on a rental property mortgage. So again, a rental property mortgage is like the classic example of good debt, and that's if it is cash flowing well for you every month in the property, right? If you are walking away with hundreds or ideally thousands of dollars in net positive cash flow, even after all those, irregular expenses are averaged in, right? So that is good debt. That debt is making you richer every month, to circle back to Robert Kiyosaki and his line, right? Okay, house hacking. This is a case where your home mortgage can be good debt if you are using that to house hack so that you are effectively living for free. And we'll just explain that super quickly. So the classic model of house hacking is you go out and you buy a multifamily property like a duplex or a triplex. You move into one unit and then you rent out the other units to tenants who are going to become your neighbors, right? And their rent, the rent from those other units, cover the entire mortgage payment, so that you effectively don't have a housing payment. And ideally, it also covers those irregular expenses we were talking about a minute ago, vacancy rate and repairs and maintenance and so forth. So that is a case where your home mortgage actually does save you money every month. So because you have now eliminated your housing payment. And there are other ways to house hack too, some of which you and I have each done. When I first bought a home, I rented out the other bedroom, and my renter, she became a very close friend of mine. She was a stranger when she moved in, but her rent covered 3/4 of the mortgage, which included the taxes and insurance and so forth. You have a fascinating story about bringing in a foreign exchange student. So yeah, why don't you
Yes.
just share that really quickly?
I mean, there was cost involved with that, but the amount of money monthly that we received at that time paid well over half of our mortgage. And we got a great experience. We're still close to him. He's in San Diego College right now. And it was a great experience, and it offset a lot of costs.
Yeah, and there are other ways to house hack too. I mean, I have a friend who used to rent out a bedroom bathroom suite in her place on Airbnb, and she found that if she could rent that for 2 long weekends a month, it covered almost all of
Wow.
her monthly housing costs. And some people who travel a lot, they'll rent out their home like the entire home while they're traveling, like while they're out of it, to help cover some of their costs. So anyway, lots of different ways to house hack, but that is a case where your home mortgage can be good debt if it is eliminating your housing payment or drastically reducing what you would be paying on rent or whatever. So that's one case. Getting into a little bit more gray area here, a little more nuance, there are some parts of the country where buying a home saves you money, a significant amount of money compared to renting in the same market, right? So, and there are other places where that's not the case, where renting is much cheaper. So, for example, in San Francisco, way cheaper to rent than it is to buy. The monthly equivalent of buying. And then there are other markets where you're better off buying, where it can save you $500 a month, $1,000 a month, having a mortgage and owning rather than renting. Especially if you include the principal pay down of portion of that monthly payment. But the point is being, the less home mortgage debt you have, the better, because it is fundamentally a living expense. So less debt is better. Buying less house is better, right? And I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole with this, but my wife and I were just talking about, we just moved back to the US a couple months ago, and we're talking about, should we buy or should we continue renting this townhouse that we're renting, or should we go buy a house? We sold our house when we moved out of Baltimore to move abroad 10 years ago. And, I had this conversation with her about how most people, the way they approach budgeting for buying a house, they'll go to the mortgage lender and they'll say, how much can I borrow? What will you let me borrow? What do I qualify to borrow? And the mortgage lender will give them an amount based on their income. And they'll say, okay, let's go buy a house at that cost, right? So they're framing that as, what's the most I can possibly spend on housing? And then they go out and spend the most they can possibly spend, as opposed to the way that you should be framing that is, what's the least amount I can spend on housing and still meet my needs and be happy, right? Because housing, again, is a living expense. And the less that you have, the less you put towards living expenses, the more you can put towards building real wealth, investments, your savings rate. So the less you spend on housing, the better. The less you borrow, the better for housing, is the bottom line here. Now, there are a couple other types of debt that can be good debt, maybe sometimes. So student loans is one of those examples. There's a classic set of data that was released, and it's a little outdated now. It's probably 5 or 6 years old. It was released by the government, showing the lifetime income value of a college degree. And the average college graduate earns about $1 million more over the course of their lifetime than the average high school graduate. So, that you can make that case. And again, these are very broad averages across the entire country. You can make the case that student loan debt does enable you to earn more throughout the course of your career, throughout the course of your life. That being said, I think in today's world, there is a little bit more nuance there, that some degrees will not help you earn more money. Some degrees will help you earn a lot more money. So you want to take a look at that from an ROI standpoint. You want to look at, what's the return on this college tuition and this student loan debt that I'm taking on, in terms of heightened income potential. Like, I can graduate college with this degree, and yes, I am taking on $100,000 in debt, but I will be able to, right off the bat, earn $30,000 more a year than I would otherwise. So, there's sort of a calculus there where student loan debt can be a type of good debt. And along similar lines, business loans, business debt can be a type of good debt if it directly leads to your business earning more money, and both in gross revenue and in net profit. But the key word there is directly. If that loan, lets you expand in a very clear and predictable way to grow your income, then that can be good debt. Of course, a lot of businesses over leverage themselves. They get into too much debt, and then it's hard for them to stay above water, cash flow wise.
Right. So, well, business would be more of a gamble.
Well, yeah, it depends on how clear your path to growth is.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a very clear and predictable path to growth, then business loans can help you grow your income and can be worth it. In our business, we have avoided debt. We have eschewed debt in our business and we have just bootstrapped this business as a mom and pop business. And there's nothing wrong with taking on business debt. Again, it can lead to higher revenue and higher profit and higher income for you, but it doesn't always, right? To your point of there being an element of risk there, Deni.
Right.
So, that can be a form of good debt if it directly leads to higher income for you, higher profit for your business. All right. One final thought here on home mortgages, because again, there's a lot of nuance there. Some people say, all right, well, I have this relatively large home mortgage already. Brian and Deni, you're telling me that this is bad debt. Should I pay it off early, or should I take the money that I could put toward paying it off early? Should I instead put that towards investments? Stock investments, passive real estate investments, like what we do in the co-investing club. And that is, again, a nuanced conversation. Right? Some of it depends on the interest rate that you're paying. If you have a 2% interest rate, then just keep that loan in place. Don't pay it off early because it's such cheap debt. And instead, take that money that you would have spent towards paying down your mortgage early and put it towards investments. Again, stock investments, real estate investments. Put that, because you can earn 8 to 10% or 7 to 10% a year on average on stock investments. In the co-investing club, we aim for returns in the mid-teens or higher every year. So, if you're only losing 2% of that money and you can invest it at 10% or 15% or 20%, and it's a form of arbitrage, and you should take that all day. Now, if your mortgage is at 7%, 8%, maybe you should think about paying that down early rather than investing. But again, that's up to you. It also depends on your risk tolerance, on your age, how long you plan to hold the property. Planning on selling that property in a few years anyway, then it doesn't make sense to put money towards paying down the balance early. There is an argument to be made for paying off the mortgage on your forever home. If you plan to retire in a home and die there eventually, there's a case to be made for paying off that mortgage before you retire to reduce your living expenses in retirement. Again, these are all kind of personal decisions. So there is some nuance with the home mortgage, but bottom line, auto loans and home mortgage loans, these are living expenses. The lower they are, the better, right? They are in most cases bad debt. Deni, is there anything you want to add to that before we call this episode complete?
I just think that any of these ideas and whatnot, you need to go over with your professional financial consultant just to make sure, because there's a lot of little things also that get, involved and in the way of all this.
No question. And yeah, a financial planner can help you work through all of this stuff for your specific situation. But yeah, we just wanted to give you a more detailed framework for,
Right.
good debt versus bad debt. Good debt makes you richer each month. Bad debt makes you poorer. And what I see a lot of people doing, as just a final thought here, when people go to buy a home, I see them make this mistake all the time where, we already talked about how they want to spend the absolute maximum that the bank will possibly give them, right? And so they're taking on the most debt possible, which is a mistake. But they justify it to themselves by saying, oh, well, my home is an investment. It's an investment. It's okay for me to overspend on it. And your home is a living expense. Real investments make you richer each month. Like, the passive real estate investments that we make in the co-investing club, those are real investments. Your stock portfolio, those are real investments. They are making you richer every single month through cash flow, through appreciation and price growth. Your home will probably go up in value over time. Not definitely. It will probably go up in value over time, and it costs you money every month in cash flow. So do not justify overspending on your home by calling it an investment. It is not. It is a living expense, and we all need a home, but the less you spend on it, the better. And the less debt you have attached to it, the better. So, all right. I feel a little preachy, a little lectury on this one, but it's an important distinction to make. So I'm going to get off my high horse. And on that note, if you got a fresh perspective from this episode, please rate, review the show, subscribe to the show. Yeah. And, and if you didn't get anything out of this episode, if you didn't like it, then let us know why. Shoot us an email, support@parkmall.com. Let us know what you want to hear more of or less of. And if you're new to the idea of passive real estate investments, real estate syndications and private notes and private partnerships and funds and all that good stuff that we look at every month, We have a free course on that stuff because most people do not understand it. So your free course, sparkrental.com/free. Check that out. It's quick and punchy. Eight videos. They're all like 5 to 10 minutes long. And on that note, stay weird, unconventional investor.